Let me introduce you Professor Jaan Valsiner. Professor Jaan Valsiner is a very important scholar in cultural psychology. He wrote a book, Introduction to Cultural Psychology, and especially he founded journal Culture and Psychology in 1990 and was his editor until, I think, the last year. And he was also editor of journal Integrative Psychological and Behavioral Science, where I experienced his perfect style of editorship. I think he is maybe the best editor whom I experienced, because he always recommended me something to cite which was very good and which I didn't know before. So my papers published there really improved after including that articles or a book. Professor Valsiner is originally from Estonia, but he moved to the United States and for many years taught psychology at Clark University. Currently, he is professor of psychology at Aalborg University in Denmark. And today he will speak about nanopsychology. As you can see now, the title of his speech is How Psychology Overlooks Reality, Introducing Nanopsychology. So please, Professor Valsiner, we are eager to hear your lecture.
Thank you, Václav. Thank you very much. Thank for everybody being here. What I try to do today is very much linked with the history of Czech lands, to which I have some very specific, deep personal connection. And in some sense, I am going to ask a question about today's psychology, whether 1968 of Czechoslovakia of the time, with a widening of perspectives before the invasion from the east, could also be replicated in the theoretical area of psychology today. Because I deeply believe that this kind of spring in theoretical psychology is very much needed. I was 17 years old in 1968, an avid listener to Radio Prague, corresponding with Radio Prague, not understanding the possible dangers at the time in Soviet Union. And I have still retained enormous fascination with Prague and all of the Czech lands, which I have finally started to visit in 1979, and have been coming back from time to time. My own history of coming to today's talk goes through a number of steps which are quite important to understand. First of all, analysis of history from the point of view of psychology itself, the history of psychology in the mirror of its making, looking at the embeddedness of psychology in the societal structure of the society. This particularly became interested in a more historical coverage, again very closely linked to the Czech lands, of the era of Rudolf II in Prague, and the way how his art focus and science focus promoted scientific progress all over Europe. But this is, of course, not yet psychology. Psychology, for my road, is very much linked to the Yokohama Manifesto, which we collectively edited for the time of the International Congress in Japan, looking at the human being, focus on the being human as a center for psychological science. This particular book was the basis for our symposium in the International Congress, which about 50 people listened to, and about 2 people made contact after that. So it was a basic failure in the middle of a big congress. And it needed to be a basic failure because psychology has run somewhere else. Psychology has moved away from being human to being computerized, being data-based, but at the same time losing connection with very basic aspects of human psyche. So following 5 years later, I was publishing a book on general human psychology with an elaboration of basic ideas that came from the Yokohama Manifesto, very much building on the history of psychology, William Stern's traditions, but widening them in the direction of cultural psychology, which had become my main area. This had implications for methodology. Back in 2010, my Estonian colleague Aro Toomela and I asked the question, how could psychology lose its heart? We assumed it has since 1930s, and I think it still has lost it. And secondly, of course, we have some alternative to the loss of heart that comes from my book that I published in 2017, and just now came out in German version, which is exactly emphasizing methodology as separate from methods. Methodology is a general scheme for building up methods. So where is a theoretical loss in psychology? Let us start from a very ordinary encounter with texts. You can open any journal in psychology and you will be confronted almost immediately with a horizontal way of writing by psychologists, which is described on the top part of the slide. A particular topic is researched by these kinds of psychologists, who are listed then by some references to their work, who demonstrates that something, that the other part, this other group, are wrong, and vice versa. So, and then the author claims proudly that one takes a position of the preferred one. So all of the exercise in this part of text is only demonstrating us that people form social groups, and social groups are sometimes put into opposition with other social groups. There is no knowledge coming out of this kind of writing in psychology. Only repetition of knowledge, only repetition of particular social preferences, power schemes, and so on. As editor of 2 journals over many years, I have had to fight with different authors about references. My goal is to make references very few. The goal of most authors is to make reference lists very large, because they are all indebted to their friends and others to give them social capital coming from being referenced. Whereas from the point of substance, many references make no sense. In contrast, the writing style could be what I call vertical spiral, which is described on the lower part of this scheme, where you look very carefully into the phenomena, select very few authors who have actually studied the phenomena deeply, and analyze how they have studied it. So, and by the result of the analysis of their deep entrance into the phenomena, you may develop new ideas that would help you science to go further. The horizontal writing does not produce any new science. The vertical spiral writing and thinking this way can. It doesn't automatically do it, but it can. So today I bring you a very new development that we have invented, nanopsychology. It is interesting that the label has become extremely appealing for many very quickly. For 30 years, editing culture and psychology, I have had to explain to everybody what cultural psychology is and what it does, and I still fail to do it. In nanopsychology, almost instantly after inventing the concept, this becomes appealing even before people understand what it means. From my point of view, introducing nanopsychology is an interesting opposite movement from present-day fashion for big data. Nanopsychology is an open systemic approach that makes the uniqueness of human life events into the data, making minimal data, and from the structural approach to unique phenomena makes maximum generalization. So instead of large samples with minimal generalization, we move to the sample of one instant, not even a person, but one instant. That leads to maximum generalization. How is that in principle possible? That is an interesting question, because we are even not used in recent years to deal with ideographic analysis. We established ideographic science in 2004 with the leadership of Peter Molenaar in Holland, and it has not really produced too much fascination since that time, although it is very basic for all of history of psychology. History of psychology has been built on individual cases from which generalizations have been made. Okay, what about single instant inside an individual case? How is it possible to make generalization from the single instant? My very strong claim is that in practice, psychology does make generalizations from the single instant, even not recognizing it. The simple example is the endless interest in the effects of psychotrauma. Psychotrauma is necessarily a single instant at a certain moment in human life. And we are looking as psychologists as if psychotrauma is a very central feature all over life course. Of course, this look is limited. Why? Because trauma is immediately modified after it has happened, or attempted to be modified in different directions, overcoming it, neutralizing it, and so on. Secondly, the single instant need not be traumatic at all. A single instant is something from your childhood or adolescence which positively fascinated you and has led all through your life to some very positive development in your own life course. No trauma, but rather the relevance of a single instant. So this was where I introduced the notion of nanopsychology. As you can see, I also sent the paper over. And this was exactly my kind of eye-opening of all psychology has been built on single instance. The very first experiment done in a particular area is necessarily a single instant. Wolfgang Köhler's discovery of chimpanzees putting two sticks together is for the first time the single instant, seeing it, observing it. Also the act was a chimpanzee of doing it, whereas of course it becomes repeated many times by other chimpanzees and even humans. And nevertheless, we are talking about as if the single instant is not relevant. It is very relevant as an innovation, as a particular something new that emerges in human development, macro level, meso level, or micro level. So what are the philosophical basis for the theory of the single instant? That it's all of our psychological ideas are, of course, embedded very nicely in a philosophical background. So what is there and how do we understand the single instant suddenly coming up as a relevant topic in my presentation? These are the two men who are responsible for that direction. Both of them are largely forgotten in psychology. Bergson is, of course, mentioned, bringing in the notion of irreversibility of time. Bachelard is sometimes mentioned, but mostly forgotten into the French philosophical history. Both of them can be seen as the starting fathers, so to say, of the nanopsychological look. Why so? The question of irreversible time is that how is irreversible time structured? For Bergson, it was not structured. It was just flowing on and on and on and on. In fact, he was adamantly opposed to the notion that it could be structured. The flow is in what is really needed. For Bachelard, actually accepting that the irreversible time flows, but it is structured by our construction of instants. So the single instant that enters into the flow of irreversible time is actually the instant that makes psychological relevant difference. Otherwise, we will be floating in irreversible time without noticing we're doing it. Well, as you know, most of psychology does not notice that psychological phenomena occur in irreversible time. We are very happily aggregating data across time. We are assuming that similar data over time are same data. The similarity to sameness transition is almost universal. It is entirely possible when time is not seen as irreversible. Without irreversible time, no focus, there will be no reason to talk about nanopsychology, and there will be all reason to talk about data accumulation. Because a simple act of turning similarity into sameness, looking at the data, guarantees that you can collect very large samples of data which are all the same, whereas actually they were only similar. Why similar? Because we are talking about open systemic phenomena that produce different kinds of innovation all the time. So this is one of the little quotes from Bachelard talking about the poetic instant, which is of course quite important for human ordinary living. The poetic instant invites, consoles, and something is familiar and non-familiar. It is a relation between opposites, and it includes affective side of touch of passion. So the poet is really the first psychologist whom we can think about, or the poetic instant is something that we human psyche is exactly the creating as a first instant of the particular poem. Later on, the poem can be rationalized, analyzed, and so on, but the touch of the poetic instant is exactly the starting point of the creation of something new in human psychological lives. So we need to clearly understand the idea of open system. It is from time to time has been emphasized in psychology, usually in textbooks or textbook-like constructions, whereas the very basic issue of the open systems, which will have profound relevance for methodology, is usually overlooked. The open systems paradigm involves constant interchange in time, in irreversible time, with the environment that guarantees that each experience is unique. So the irreversibility of time, together with the open system nature of the human psyche, guarantees to us exactly the uniqueness of an instant. Without that open system focus, we do not have that guarantee. And that makes it exactly the question of maximum inclusive framework where each single instance informs about generalization. But how? Ludwig von Bertalanffy, back in the 1950s and before and after, was of course the originator of the general system theory and was emphasizing the open system in physics. Now, open systems in natural sciences deal with a question of movement, interchange of system and its environment in both matter and the flow in and out, whereas closed systems are only restricted to matter exchange. That is physical sciences. But what about us? In the flow of human living, each new event is a singular act. A person relates to the environment, which is turned into Umwelt, in Jakob von Uexküll's terms, and this relation to the Umwelt changes a person to move to the next time relating with the Umwelt, another Umwelt, which changes a person again with a feed-forward loop into the next time and next time and next time. You can see that at every step, the particular experiences are unique, but they are all produced by the interchange with the world around us, the Umwelt around us. Not just environment, but the humanly made Umwelt that is part of the environment. So what is science for psychology? What is analog for matter that is being open systems allows to transport in and out? And my possible answer for that, and also the reason why I'm emphasizing nanopsychology as an extension of cultural psychology, is that a function of science that can be internalized and externalized in our relation with the Umwelt is exactly the root for a particular open systemic look. That brings us to the question of what kind of sign. What is a sign, and what kinds of signs do you see? Following Charles Sanders Peirce's definition of sign, sign is something that represents something in some way. Very general definition, but it implies that there is a certain difference between the phenomenon, the object, and its representation or presentation, to be more exact. Now, the presentation in terms of signs can be of different kinds, as you can see here. These can be node-type signs descriptions, a point, X, or number 5. You can see from here that all quantitative psychology is basically based on signs. Every number that is ever assigned to a psychological phenomenon is nothing more than a numerical sign. This puts enormous constraint on our usual definition of science in psychology, which in American version often comes down to the act of attributing numbers to psychological phenomena. You would see that in American textbooks that science in psychology is guaranteed by attributing numbers to psychological phenomena, not specifying what kind of phenomena, but specifying that numbers are being assigned. Who does the assignment on what grounds? It leaves left open. So the quantitative perspective, as you can see from here in psychology, is necessarily a qualitative perspective, or one version of qualitative perspective. It is similar to all other sign-mediated representation or presentation of psychological phenomena. Signs can also be field-like. They can be regular or irregular in size. You can see that human psychological experiencing that we may treat as a phenomenon of our study can be represented in very many different kinds of signs, all of which have the same character. They represent something in some capacity for somebody. Now, quite obviously, the quantitative representation is very widely popular in recent 80 plus years in psychology. No doubt, it is very far developed, but is it adequate to the phenomenon? This question can be asked over and over again. Qualitative side, which is very often dealt with in terms of categories, like the point you see on the left, gain more popularity. But does it mean that the popularity actually leads to generalization? Is an open question. You will see nowadays qualitative perspective in psychology following more or less the same lead as quantitative has done, namely accumulating qualitative categories, developing different frequency counts of these qualitative categories, completely getting rid of the irreversible time. Because irreversible time in classic psychology has not been relevant. So we do not take it into consideration. So semiotic turn in psychology may be coming, if you follow what I'm saying. If science are answer to the discipline moves into integration with semiotics. But there is an interesting problem here. Semiotics in its usual form is actually also time-free. It is not linked with the irreversibility of time at all. It basically is elaboration of the sign attribution that you saw before, exactly this, on different forms. Most likely the semiotics will deal with field-like signs and also some irregular field-like signs, but nevertheless it is not taking the flow of the irreversible time into account. So I introduced the notion of dynamic semiosis, probably one of the very few examples of this happens, which is actually borrowing the notion of sign organization from biology, looking at the notion of signs regulating other signs, regulating the ongoing action, and as a result of it happening to do it as an inhibitor of inhibitors. That's a very central biological principle. So you can also see that this notion of increasing the hierarchy of sign regulation leads to flexibility of relating to the world with the whole human psyche. So the answer to psychological problems is not in the notion of accounting for existing variability or variance that we are looking at, but actually accounting for amplification of variability, variability that we have not yet seen up to the present moment, but we might see and we are likely to see tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and the last moment. In the abstract I sent you, I put in a particular graph about how psychologists treat normal distribution, with the opposite focus on the one hand looking at averages or prototypes, on the other hand looking at the outliers. The outliers that we usually get rid of become actually the focus of nanopsychological treatment as they occur, because the very first instance that is to be recorded in a distribution is exactly nanopsychological in its form. It needs interpretation by its own. So now we come to what we have introduced in 3 courses or 2.5 courses of nanopsychology I have recently taught. First course was taught in Tallinn, in Tallinn University in February. The second course just ended in Brazil, in Federal University of Bahia, in Salvador, Bahia. And the third one will happen in Japan, in Retsumeikan University in Japan in September. So based on these 3 courses, I am developing a specific focus on particular look at single instance, discovery of single instance, and also generalization from single instance. What you see here is an invented notion of Gestalt template, which is situated, you see, in the reversible time, and it is looking to the future. Gestalt template is a new word, except for the notion of Gestalt, but it is actually something that psychology in its history has already lived through under different disguises. You could very nicely locate this my Gestalt template notion in the long-lost notion of apperception. That is perception that is anticipating something happening in the future. Now, in the case of Gestalt template, we are looking at expectations of what we pay attention to or fail to pay attention to in the next moment in our lives. Each and every one of you will have moments where you suddenly realize, oh, I didn't even notice this. And this is exactly why your Gestalt template is not noticing something that is absolutely obvious. For example, my best example from my own life is I lived 2 months in a little apartment in Salvador, Bahia, and only by the end of the 2nd month I noticed that there is a television set in the living room. I have completely overlooked the obvious, which is right there, perceivable very clearly, but for me it had played absolutely no role for my particular Gestalt template of attention. So the failures of attention are actually telling us something of where the generalization of single instance starts, but doesn't end. So this is something to look forward to in the future. So to general summary, to give us more time to discussion, I would give you this particular issue. Instants are formative ruptures in the experience of person in irreversible time. Following that, nanopsychology analyzes the transformation of this instance. And nanopsychology is ideographically nomothetic in its structural generalization. So it operates on single instant, but the goal is to generalize to generic instant, like our old science is interested in generalization. In the process of this generalization, we lose some material, purposefully so, and then, of course, we gain abstractness, which comes from the loss of the empirical material. So what are the implications of this for psychology? I think the implications are quite understandable if you start thinking of the practical work of psychologists. Practical work can be that of clinical psychologists working with a concrete person and concrete person's life instances, organizational psychologists working on a concrete organization undergoing change in the present time, and so on and so forth. So my point is that the implication of nanopsychology is turning the practical work of practical psychologists back or forward to the research psychology, which has usually been not operating within the basic of single cases or single instance. So that would require a totally different look at generalization process. Statistical generalization is simply not possible for the simple reason that there is no sample. There is only the single instant. What kind of alternatives are there? There are very interesting issues to figure out, maybe with the help of astrophysicists. Why astrophysicists? Astrophysicists are, in a way, de facto operating as nano researchers. Their access to the data is very limited, dependent on very much exploration of very few possible celestial bodies. And also some are not accessible at all because of the distance. But the generalization that they try to make starts from the very basic organization of this concrete evidence for the generalization about human or the celestial world in general. Well, I'm jumping from psychology very far to astrophysics because to illustrate the similarity of generalization tasks across different sciences. So that is basically all I wanted to bring to you, and now I'm very eager to hear your comments and questions and criticisms. Let me stop the share for the time being so we can see your faces, which would be nice. Although I see many non-faces as well, so thank you.
Yeah,
Everybody who is ready to reveal your faces is very welcome because we are human beings relating to each other. So any questions, any criticism, any queries, you should not accept these claims as if they are obvious or simple. They are totally non-obvious, as you saw, and they are totally non-simple, with the implications which may be traumatic for you, which is another example of single instant. So my goal here today is to create many single instances of your professional psychological trauma, to which you will be looking for answers in the next 5 minutes or more. So any questions, please?
Can I start, please?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. Thank you very much. My first question would be if this attitude to psychology is somehow connected with Jerome Bruner's differentiation of two ways of thinking in psychology, or two ways of thinking in general, named narrative and paradigmatic thinking. Is there some connection?
Yes, of course. Quite obviously, the flow of irreversible time gives us a narrative story.
Mm-hmm.
However, the analysis of the narrative is not narrative as a given thing or object, not the accumulation of different narrated elements, but the sequence. A particular sequence when the narrating process emerges some new instant, and this is now follows Specialized notion, breaking in the irreversible time, and that new instant starts to be analyzable as such by its own basic structure. In this sense, that part of Bruner fits. Paradigmatic one, not really. It doesn't. In fact, the paradigmatic one is the opposite or the enemy of this kind of discovery. The narrative flow would be the place where the discovery is possible, not automatically given, because we do not need to look for these moments in the narrating process, but we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And now I will I will save my other questions for later time. Thank you. If there would be any some other questions.
So I don't think my presentation has been so traumatic that you have no questions. So
I will go further with my questions. Is there some possibility to use your concept of nanopsychology for researching or for studying something other than instance?
yeah, of course. You can basically every instant in whatever domain of human living is in principle open to the study of the structural generalization from it. So it need not be the internal aspect of psyche, which I have been playing on this tower. It can be anything else. Societal transformation, particular social transformation, particular event in social life, for example, political demonstration, for instance, a massive group phenomenon which comes very often even without any preparation, and then has its own particular dynamics of proceeding and ending and so on. So the instant here is actually treated very abstractly. Instant can be anything that breaks a flow of irreversible time for the given domain of phenomena.
Yeah. So it's more general, yeah. So we can always say that it's everything is or everything studied in nanopsychology is some kind of instant. Probably.
Yes, because again, go back to Bachelor and as well as Bergson. They are philosophers who operate at a high level of abstraction, and the only concepts they need here are the concept of time, irreversible time, and secondly, structured introduction of the irreversible time, which is instant. How that instant, in what aspect of practical life is actually discovered, is totally left open by them. So in nanopsychology, I bring it down to the psyche level. It could be done on social psychological level. It can be done in organizational psychological level. The only difference is that it operates on the basis of the single instant datum. And the open question is how. How exactly could you generalize from a single instant? I got to that idea actually looking at the work of paleoanthropologists. The notion of the template, the Gestalt template, comes from thinking through what paleoanthropologists have found and how they operate. They are lucky if they get parts of skeleton or proto-hominids to some extent covered. I think the maximum coverage they have is 40% in the case of so-called specimen Lucy.
Yeah.
Yet, nevertheless, based on that 40%, they are capable of reconstructing the whole skeleton of that proto-hominid. They can only this is only possible if they have a particular established Gestalt template which fills in the bones that are missing. Simply empirical inductive generalization from the 40% of the skeleton will never fill in that, because it counts only the bones. But the Gestalt template looks for what kind of bone must be here in between here and here, so that we can reconstruct the whole. So you can easily see the value of Gestalt or gun-sight thinking that psychology has lost since 1930s, basically, to be brought back into but in this case, the nanopsychological side. Because the Gestalt or the structure of the particular generic phenomenon is what we're after. We want to see how a person, unknown who the person is able under some circumstances to cope with traumatic life events of the past, and in other circumstances cannot cope with it. What makes a difference? How is it possible to cope with the trauma as well as overcome the trauma? How is it possible that a very popular topic for clinical psychologists of post-traumatic disease is actually capturing 5% of people, 70% who live this through get stronger. This is an Australian study done some years ago. So, psychologists who are interested in the problematic side, but in real life, so aside from the problematic side, is an actually living on side. You live through hardships and you get stronger rather than become traumatized. Of course, the people who get stronger do not go to a psychologist consulting room. Only the others do, or may do. Yeah. So you see, the question is that of abstracted conditional generalizability of the structure of the event. Yeah. So that's, but this is a part not yet developed for nanopsychology. It's in the making. If you look at my volume on Rudolf II, there are some first preliminaries in that direction, but they're only very first. So.
Yeah. Thanks. This remembers me the author, Soviet Russian author Luria.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also made some there was some observation of a patient with traumatized brain, if you know the famous study. Yeah, and he made it was really leap forward in psychology, because he opened the neuropsychology, the new way how to. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
this is a good point to bring in. Luria is in some sense a key figure in understanding how nanopsychology can function. He would have one single patient among 700 others, who demonstrates hyper-productive memory capacity.
Yeah.
The case he would study for 30 years, demonstrating that this capacity is in place over the 30 years, demonstrating also when this capacity becomes challenged and doesn't work. And this is a single extreme case with single extreme instance of asking the person to remember something. Single instant, the person does it perfectly. Going to the extreme case allows him to actually look at our ordinary cases. So the basic answer for Luria was a hyper-developed rapid synesthesia, which allowed the person to memorize. No, we do not have that. We are failing. But when we need to rememorize something, we are necessarily developing in the same direction as Luria's patient SS had. So now where the Sereshevsky example stopped, and why Luria also demonstrated, is also quite interesting. The man started to give performances on stage about the hyper memory capacity. He goes to the stage, he's given a task, he immediately remembers it all, reproduces it, everybody is fascinated. Now another person asks him a question. And here the trouble starts. He was very good at memorizing, but not good at forgetting. In other sense, he started to make errors of interference of the previous memory to the new task. And that is a good example of conditional nature of generalization. Not only did he have a good memory, but he had a very hyper memory under the conditions of no interference from the past. So if he could separate this task and that task in time, then he could remember it 30 years later. But if it half a minute later, then he started making mistakes. So and this is well, probably something like this hypersynesthesia, anybody of you who are ever singing an opera somewhere would probably have to live through. You have to remember with 100% adequacy the text you are going to sing or recite. Yeah, you cannot do it at 90% level or 40% level.
Yeah.
So, and this is a task which in psychology, again, we are not usually looking at. We are not looking at demanded hyper-performance. We are very much limited to school-type situations where we look at children's memories a little bit better than less than one child and another child, but not really a holistic gestalt of a text which needs to be presented, which cannot be mistaken in. So the same you would apply to issues of, for example, neurosurgeons who need to know precisely the whole structure of the human brain in order to operate as neurosurgeons. You cannot collect pieces of the brain. You have to know exactly what structure we are dealing with and where the problems are. So another good, somewhat rhetorical example of the need for Gestalt perspective in psychology today, not just in the history of psychology.
Thanks. If there is some time for other questions, if
Yeah,
I
sure.
may.
As long as other people are so traumatized, so let us continue.
Yeah. This topic is very close to my thinking, or not thinking, but close to my focus in psychology. So very
Which is
good for me. Yeah. I like evolutionary psychology or cognitive psychology, but I also am very fan of Bachelard, of Gilbert Durand, and so on. So and of Jerome Brunner also. So narrative psychology is one of my primary topics. Okay, my question was connected with Gaston Bachelard. You said that the notion of poetic notion.
poetic instant.
Yeah. Can you say more about that, please?
Well, I can say that I was fascinated when I read it. And I realized that there is something in it that can be developed further. And what is that something in it? Now this comes my interpretation beyond Bachelard. I think the way he is trying to look at the unity of the opposites in the poetic instant is a starting point for restoration in a positive sense of dialectical perspectives for understanding human psyche. Now, the dialectical perspective has been utilized in ways in history of European societies that basically have eradicated the central issue of the dialectical notion. And the central issue doesn't come from Hegel, it doesn't come from Marx, it doesn't come from them, it comes from Fichte, and it emphasizes the relevance of what Fichte called second negation. First negation is stating something is not something else. Second negation is the first negation is not relevant, although it exists. First negation could be men are different from women and vice versa. Okay. Thousands of psychologists all over the world look at gender differences on very traditional group analysis basis. This sample of men is different from this sample of women. Statistically significant, very nice, we have the finding, and the finding means nothing. Why? Because the reality of human living includes unity of men and women under different circumstances. That means that in every case, somebody marries somebody else, the difference between men and women has to be negated, and it is replaced by a unity of the two. The particular way of unifying the two, different, recognizably different, but at the same time commonly unifiable people. And that would be the second negation of Vita. Now, psychology has done enormous work on using the first negation, but very rarely goes to the second negation. Now, of course, the dialectical method being so much maligned in different places, Russia and America, the similar ways, needs to be reorganized in different ways, has to be developed further. And there is where Bachelard's intuitions from the poetic side may become extremely interesting. I didn't notice there was also something in the chat, but I didn't notice where it was. Can you repeat it or can you show it to me? Oh, wait a second. I see where the chat is. Just a second. Okay. Since my microphone is unavailable in typing my questions, you argue that psychology often overlooks reality by focusing on average data. In your view, how can we shift the focus back to the individual, irreversible process of living without losing the status of rigorous science? Well, rigorous science is a label. I would say that the statistically accumulated data in psychology are not rigorous science, but they are basically artifacts, powerful artifacts done by right ways, correct ways, but not representing the phenomena. The rigorous science starts from an analysis of the phenomena, in the particular cases, of course, even if you do not look at the irreversibility of time. Even then, the focus on the phenomena here and now that you look at, even then the rigorous science starts there. The way you generalize from the phenomena needs to retain the rigor. The rigor comes from the adequacy of generalization. Every generalization leaves out some data. There is no way of keeping all the data. You selectively throw out some of the data for the sake of seeing the phenomenon more adequately in abstract terms. Now, if you have done that adequately, if the model you have developed applies to not only this single example, but also many other examples, then you are doing rigorous science. Again, the notion is the focus here is on abstraction and generalization, not on the data collection. The data collection goes into the depth of where you look for the relevant phenomena. Not everywhere, but you have your own expectation for the phenomena. You go looking exactly for that. So people who look for trauma already have a focus on where to look. Yeah? We look for trauma. We leave aside the positive experience of the childhood. Yeah? So that is an example of a very clear look into the phenomenon. But the trauma now and its overcoming needs to be analyzed as that trauma of that person and so on. That would be the longitudinal, maybe retrospective, still longitudinal analysis of the life course of a traumatized person. My Danish student Caroline Westberg has just published a book on overcoming trauma, based on an autobiography of a Danish woman who was very explicit. This may be quite interesting for you to have a look at as well, as a case study, individual case study of the struggle of overcoming, of sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding again and again, of doing it. I would consider that rigorous science. Luria's example of man with a large memory is a rigorous science. His analysis of 700 brain damage cases from World War II were also done rigorously because they were all done on single case basis. If you look at Luria's traumatic aphasia book, it's filled with case descriptions. Not as good descriptions as you would have nowadays with fMRI, but very good case descriptions for 1940s. So the idea is that you look at the particular brain damaged patient, how the patient becomes rehabilitated, the process of rehabilitation. That is rigor on the analysis. So Let me see what else is there. Thank you, Natalie. That was very helpful. Let me see what else is there. No? Oh, thank you. Very good. So I'm glad that you were here, Mari. So that's very good. So any other question?
I will ask also a question. Taiwanese indigenous psychologist Kuo Jaan, he around 2000 he published an article that perhaps some global universal psychology might be made if for every culture people who are knowledgeable about that culture will create indigenous psychology for that culture. And then some similar indigenous psychologies the scholars will meet and they will create together like more universal psychology being usable for their two cultures. Do you think that by there is a limited number of people in the world? So even if we take each person as a source for a single person study and studying like behavior and science used by that person, there could be something as unification of these individual psychologies. Do you think it might be possible to unify a psychology if the research becomes studying single cases and single people?
Yeah, very good question, Václav, because this is really the quintessence of the history of indigenous psychologists over the last 50 or so years, maybe starting from Philippines in the 1970s and so. In a way, this is a very natural desire to keep a particular cultural pattern of a given society unique in their analysis. So Japanese way, Korean way, Filipino way, and so on, they're all, so to say, taking the cross-cultural psychology map and saying each of the cultures in the cross-cultural psychology map have their own indigenous feature, which needs to be preserved. Okay. This makes perfect sense. Now, so from that point of view, the most indigenous psychology in the world is North American psychology, which, interestingly enough, doesn't pretend to be that. Because in a social power position, you have the luxury of not seeing your own limits. Whereas when you're a Filipino psychologist who is confronted with standardized tests coming from North America, you immediately ask, but this doesn't fit us in Philippines. Yeah. But now, let us think what happens if we succeed having 200 different indigenous psychologies all over the globe. We get unification by groups of individuals who belong to this particular society. But this particular society is never unique. It involves migrants in, migrants out. It involves fascination with somebody else. To talk about cricket as an indigenously Indian activity would be completely overlook the history of particular colonization of India by bringing top-level Indian children to Britain to start playing cricket. So, in other sense, particular interferences from one society to another go at multiple levels, with education, through sports, and so on. That means that we will never succeed in having a homogeneous group of indigenous psychology for Philippines or from Estonia and so on. They're all mixed. Now, what is an alternative? What would allow the same way of thinking of creating different indigenous psychologies to go to the maximum extreme? I think this is a notion what I introduce is so-called personal culture. Each individual in the world is a unique culture. We are all indigenous in ourselves. What does it mean? It means we recognize inter-individual variability inside the same society. We recognize personal variability inside ourselves, our life course, and we at the same time look for generality across human beings. My way of being an Estonian and somebody from New Guinea are totally different. But in terms of semiotic mediation, regulation of our lives by science, very different science, we are very similar. Yes, please, you have the raised, please.
So you can go on with that line of thinking about indigenous way of nanopsychology.
Yeah, the nanopsychology grows out, of course, from the idea of personal culture. That's clear. The personal culture notion has been there for about 25 years in my little mind. And the nanopsychology very recent or relatively recent. So you could say that the nanopsychology is an extension of the methodology focus based on the personal culture idea that I had. So it's they're connected. The methodology side is connected with the substance and so on. As an effort to see variety, diversity in unity, or unity in diversity. And that is really the crucial question here, is to look at very high inter-individual variation together with a basic similarity of the ways of psychological functioning. Of course, you can immediately see that it's provable by capacity to talk different languages, translate, and so on. This is all clear. But the abstract notion of unity in diversity, the basics of human beings in psychological sense, which is parallel to, for example, anatomical generalization. Yeah? Because no matter where we are in the world, as long as we are Homo sapiens, we have the basic anatomical similarity, not the sameness. We are all of different sizes and so on, but the similarity is at the level of basic structure. Can there be a basic structure, for example, in narrative handling of everyday life events? Probably yes. But the basic structure of it will have to come not from categorizing different narrative types, but from looking at how one narrative element starts to operate upon the other and the third, and how it becomes overcome. Now, this is, I'm again sitting on my hobby horse here, so you see. But anyway, this would be one issue here. We need generalization that unifies diversity with generalization. That is. And once we get that, some way or another, then our practical work becomes much easier, because downward from the generalized knowledge, if the knowledge is adequate, downward to the practice is very direct step. Now there is no direct step. There is a literature data are here, and my practice in concrete people is here. They do not meet. They can meet, but they don't meet. So. So anybody else? No other? Well, if not, then not.
We have one new question.
Okay, there is another question. If psychology, Natalie, thank you. If psychology keeps overlooking reality, does it run the risk of becoming a tool for social engineering rather than a science of human liberation? Absolutely. And you see the examples of this already all over the world. Because social engineering is, of course, supported by the declared evidence from psychology. But how can we return to a psychology that actually serves the human soul in its specific cultural setting? Well, yeah. by openness of our categorizations. Instead of rushing to categorize somebody as something or somebody else, we may want to try to see the life world of the other through the eyes of the other. This is a basic notion of Einfühlung that Theodor Lipps years ago brought into psychology. Einfühlung into the world, not just to the understanding of the other. And I think that particular focus is a starting ground for our solution. Let me give you an example here. The example is documented in year 2000 in comparison of primate researchers in Japan and in North America. A Japanese primate research professor tells a doctoral student, go to the monkey cage and observe and come back to tell you what you felt. The North American one says to the similar graduate student, doctoral student, here is a list of behaviors you need to observe. Go to the monkey cage, observe these behaviors and come back to me. Now you see that the pre-given repertoire of behaviors is of course a nice guidance. Basically it's a way of accounting, whereas the Japanese version is a way of seeing, looking and seeing, developing one's own what I call educated intuition. If you look into my book of 2017, there's a little methodology cycle that we have been developing for 26 years. In the center of that cycle is educated intuition. We all educate our intuition in our practices, research practices, psychological practices. We do not do it systematically. We do it as the events or instances that trigger us tell us, but we do it. We develop specific Gestalt template for understanding somebody else. The Gestalt template has to be wide, that is a Japanese solution, or narrow, the American solution. Both of them are still ways of looking. One looks narrowly, pre-categorized, the other looks widely, may end up in categorizing too, of some kind, but at least there is a wider starting point. This is my effort to answer your question. Thank you, Natalie.
So does someone has some another question? If no, then thank you, Professor Valsiner, for being our guest today, and thank you for your very interesting lecture and answering all of our questions. And thanks to all the participants to come today. And I hope that you can come the next time as well. We plan to invite someone to some online seminar organized by the section of theoretical and general psychology about twice a year. So again, in autumn, we will invite some interesting scholar to have a talk for us. So
thank you, Václav. Thank you, Václav. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. If you have any questions, just email me. That's the easiest way.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.